Over the many years that I've hosted the Atheist Experience TV show, I've had the chance to engage in informal debates with plenty of callers. And I've noticed a couple curious things. The first is that arguments seem to kind of run in cycles. The popularity of a particular apologetic, it's almost as if they've listened to their favorite apologist, grabbed a script from them, whether or not they understand it, and then decided to run with it. And then after the argument's been addressed and debunked, it kind of falls out of favor for a little while and a new argument crops up. The other thing that I've noticed is that if a Christian doesn't begin with "you just have to have faith" or some version of Pascal's wager, they're almost certainly going to end the discussion that way. In its original form, Pascal's wager is an apologetic argument that attempts to demonstrate that belief in God is warranted based on decision theory and probability. Essentially, it's an assessment of risk versus reward that tries to outline why believing in God is the safe bet, given all the available information. We'll take a look at the original version of Pascal's wager a little later, and I'll talk about what I think Pascal got right and what I think he got wrong. But I wanted to start with a more colloquial version, something you're more likely to hear every day. And there are countless versions of Pascal's wager, and we'll cover some of the different ways that you might come across this that you may or may not recognize. But in general, the basics of the argument run a little something like this. If you believe that a God exists, and you're right, you've gained an eternity in heaven. And if you're wrong, you've lost little or nothing. But if you don't believe that a God exists, and you're right, you've gained little or nothing. But if you're wrong, you've lost an eternity in heaven, and you may have gained yourself an eternal, suffering existence in hell. Basically, the best bet, the safe bet, is to believe that God exists. What could possibly be wrong with that?
Before we get to the specifics about what might be wrong with Pascal's wager, let's check out some of the alternate versions that you're likely to hear and offer some responses. And most of the responses are going to be in the form of a question, and that's important.
In arguments and discussions, asking questions using the Socratic method to lead someone towards an understanding of an issue is sometimes viewed as a trick. You're trying to trick me into accepting something that I wouldn't otherwise accept. And I understand how people can see it that way. But the truth is, that method is not a trick in the sense that it is an attempt at deception. It's a tool used to eliminate deception. When you're asking people questions, when you're using the Socratic method to guide them towards an answer, you're not trying to trick them, you're trying to untrick them.
What if you're wrong? Great question. Have you thought about this question too? What if you're wrong? What if you're wrong about which God is real, or if a God is real? What if you're wrong about whether or not belief is the criteria upon which your afterlife is based? What if there's a God who values intellectual honesty? What if there's a God who puts us in the world with many claims about many gods, and the ultimate test is to reward those who rightly reject all of them on the grounds that belief isn't warranted by the evidence? What if the Muslims are right, or the Hindus, or the Jains, the Buddhists, or the Scientologists? What if none of them are right? Do you really think it's wise to make a decision like this on insufficient evidence and base life and afterlife decisions on that? What would it take to change your mind? There's a great quote from Homer J. Simpson that I love. Suppose we've chosen the wrong God. Every time we go to church, we're just making him madder and madder. Eternity is a long time to be wrong. I suppose it is, though if you're right, I guess I'll actually find out the truth after I've died, so I won't actually be wrong for eternity. I'll just be punished for being wrong for eternity. Does that seem moral and just to you? Why would a God give me a brain and then punish me for honestly reaching the wrong conclusion? You're risking everything for nothing, for no hope of gain. Am I really risking everything? It seems to me that you're suggesting I give up valuable aspects of my life on the hope of eternal reward without offering me any way to determine if that eternal reward is real. So far as I'm concerned, this life is everything, and the afterlife, until it's demonstrated to be real, is nothing. And aren't you risking more than I am? Not only are you sacrificing valuable aspects of the one and only life we both know you're going to have, you're also making a decision about an afterlife based on insufficient information. If you believe that there's a good chance that there's an afterlife, but you can't know which one is correct, isn't the safe bet to keep your options open? Why sacrifice all of the other potential afterlives in favor of the one you've chosen? As far as I can tell, I'm living the one and only life I know I'll get in the best way I know how. What's wrong with that? Here are a few more versions that play on the same points and can be responded to in a similar manner. If you're living life like there's no God, you'd better be right. It's safer to believe in God even if there's no proof that he exists. What have you got to lose? Aren't you afraid of hell? And now we've drilled down to one of the primary fears that religions exploit because they invented it. A fear of eternal torture and torment. Am I afraid of hell? Absolutely not. Why should I be? Do I have any good reason to think that it's true? If I were convinced that hell is real, would I be confident that there's anything I could do to avoid it? Not at all. Moreover, the model proposed by Christianity is an immoral one that props up their God as a sort of mafia boss, glibly suggesting, "That's a nice soul you've got there. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it." One of the most frequent objections to Pascal's wager is that by focusing on a single specific version of Christianity, it makes the mistake of ignoring other afterlife models. And that's true, but we need to be careful to avoid implying that the argument is wrong because it only evaluates a single proposition. That's actually a good thing. That's what we should want all arguments to do. The real value in pointing out that it ignores other afterlife models is that this demonstrates that the wager unfairly and inaccurately evaluates the risk, implying that there's no risk when there may in fact be great risk. In Pascal's version, if you reject his God, you've risked nothing. But this is only true if there's no possibility that some other afterlife model is correct. Essentially, if Pascal is correct about which God is real, and if Pascal is correct about the nature of the possible afterlife experiences, and if Pascal is correct that belief is the criteria upon which this afterlife is rewarded, then he might have a safe bet. Maybe. But the wager ignores all of this in its risk assessment. What about all those other proposed gods and their demands and expectations? When we look at the seemingly infinite pantheon of possible gods and afterlives, the wager becomes much less clear. Should we bet on the best possible heaven, or should we bet to avoid the worst possible hell? But even within Christianity, there isn't consensus about either the afterlife or the criteria by which one attains it. Some believe in a literal hell. Others believe in annihilation theory, where you merely cease to exist, which for some may actually be preferable to a continued existence as an eternal supplicant to a god. Within Christianity, there are different thoughts about which criteria will be used in determining what sort of afterlife we'll have. Is it based on belief? Works? Belief and works? Is it salvation by grace? Is it a gift? Or is it a seemingly arbitrary, predetermined result? There are many who believe that there's nothing you can do to get to heaven. God either lets you in or doesn't for his own reasons. Additionally, the argument, in its colloquial form, assumes that belief is a choice, as if you can merely decide to believe. Can you actually do that? I don't see how it's possible, and Pascal definitely understood that people can't merely choose to believe something, which makes it curious that the modern, simpler version of Pascal's wager departs from the original. Some versions imply that this is the safe bet in the sense that you can merely act as if you believe and get the reward. Isn't it a bit absurd to think that God might be fooled by an insincere profession of belief? Robert Oxton Bolt wrote, "A belief is not merely an idea that the mind possesses. It's an idea that possesses the mind." The argument claims that there's no risk involved in believing that God exists. Really? As far as I can tell, we're risking many aspects of the one and only life that we know we'll get. Every second spent in prayer and worship is then wasted. Beliefs don't live in a vacuum, and each thing we accept helps inform our decision-making processes. Your ability to reason is constructed out of the things you believe or don't believe, and every false belief you hold increases the likelihood that you'll accept other false beliefs. Your beliefs inform your actions have consequences for yourself and others. I'd say there's considerable risk. As Voltaire said, if you can get people to believe absurdities, you can get them to commit atrocities. And the reality is that if you believe in, for example, the God of the Bible, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with it. Depending on your interpretation of the book purported to be God's Word, you might be inclined to be wrong about the age of the earth or other scientific facts. You might stand in opposition to equal rights. You might find yourself voting against your own best interest because a religion-based objection to one particular idea has you siding with one political representative over another. Some believers bring along a lot of this extra baggage, ideas that they think are correct and required in order to live the Christ-like life that will get them into heaven. Some believe in the power of intercessory prayer, and some do it to the point that they shun proper medical treatment for themselves and for their children. Even those who don't risk their life or the lives of others based on a single false belief may deny themselves many of the joys that life has to offer. If nothing else, you may find that you've sacrificed your humanity, integrity, and any opportunity to discover the truth on the altar of an idea that seemed like it might be a safe bet. But let's assume for a moment that there truly was no risk. What does that say about the God you believe in? There's no requirement beyond this risk-free version of belief? You can just believe and then do whatever you like? What kind of God is willing to give you infinite reward when you've made no investment? Why then would he require belief? If belief is without risk, why isn't it equivalent then to disbelief? What kind of being rewards a safe bet, zero investment belief instead of a genuine understanding of and appreciation for his character? But let's take a look at Pascal's original version of the wager. Blaise Pascal was, among other things, a brilliant mathematician. The story of his religious conversion, though, is not an exercise in reason and wasn't the product of his own suggested wager. It's reported that Pascal had a powerful religious vision and recorded that experience in a note, which he then sewed into whichever coat he would be wearing. A servant reportedly discovered the note sewn into Pascal's coat after his death. After his religious vision, he began to write more and more about religion. I mention this not because it's a relevant critique of his argument, but because I wonder how many more scientific and mathematical insights we might have gained from Pascal if it hadn't been for this vision. I don't know whether his vision was a true revelation from God or if it had a purely natural cause, but in either case, before that vision, we had a brilliant mind producing valuable insights, and after the vision, we really didn't get much of value. If God did give Pascal a strong religious vision, then the most clear effect of this vision was to stifle creative progress on real issues in favor of constructing one of the worst apologetic arguments the world has ever seen. A full reading of the original version of Pascal's wager takes over 7 minutes. I know, because I just tried it. So let's pull out some specific quotes and talk about what Pascal thought, how it's a little different from the modern colloquial versions, and what he got right and what he got wrong. He begins his discourse by saying, if there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since having neither parts nor limits, he has no affinity to us. We are then incapable of knowing either what he is or if he is. Now, that's a curious statement to make, because if you don't know what he is or if he is, how did you determine that he's infinitely incomprehensible? How did you determine that he has neither parts nor limits? Clearly, this is just a response to the standard definition of God, a specific Christian definition of God that defines God or defined God at the time of Pascal in this limitless way. But Pascal's brilliant, and he recognizes that God is beyond our comprehension, and because of that, it's not something that we can reason ourselves toward. He actually continues and basically chastises the people who criticize Christians, saying, who then will blame Christians for not being able to give a reason for their belief, since they profess a religion for which they cannot give a reason? They declare in expounding it to the world that it's foolishness. And he quotes 1 Corinthians 1:21. And then you go on to complain that they do not prove it. If they proved it, they would not keep their word. It is in lacking proofs that they are not lacking in sense. which is Pascal basically saying, hey, there's no way to prove that God exists. That's absurd. So how can you criticize Christians for not being able to prove that God exists? As a matter of fact, the fact that they can't prove it is what demonstrates that they're being honest and sincere. And if that's the case, then one wonders why people have spent so long and so much time attempting to prove that God exists. Now, obviously, the presuppositionalists don't bother doing that anymore, but the evidentialists do. Why does William Lane Craig spend time on the Kalam cosmological argument? Why do we deal with any other argument other than Pascal's wager? If Pascal is correct, and God is incomprehensible, and is not subject to reasoned proofs, then we're stuck. And he recognized this. So he begins his actual wager by saying God is or he isn't. Which side are we going to pick? Reason can't decide anything here. There's an infinite chaos separating us from God. So how are you going to bet? And throughout his discourse, he has the token skeptic in quotes and responds to him. You know, the skeptic chimes in right off the bat, says, I blame them for making a choice, for he who chooses heads and he who chooses tails are equally at fault. They're both in the wrong. The true choice is not to wager at all. And Pascal points out that you must wager. It's not optional. And in this, he's actually correct. There is no choice. There is no middle ground between believing and not believing. But Pascal's only concerned with whether or not you believe in the Christian God, specifically this narrow formulation of the Christian God that he was familiar with and that he accepted. And he's only contrasting belief in that God versus disbelief in that God. And so whether you believe in Zeus or Hathor or no God at all of those still count as disbelief in the Christian God, his Christian God. So you can't say, I'm not taking a side. His position is specifically a logical dilemma. Belief in his version of the Christian God versus not believing in his version of the Christian God. And after he settles this point, he goes on to the initial part of the actual wager, saying, you have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. This is basically Pascal saying, hey, we have an incentive, we have a motivation to want to be right. It's almost as nice as saying I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible, except that from where I sit, Pascal isn't actually concerned with the truth. He thinks he already has it and is then trying to convince people that there's a good reason for them to wager on the truth that he's accepted. He then goes on to say, let us estimate the two chances. Let's figure out what the gain and the potential loss is. And he flatly says, if you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then without hesitation that he is. Is that really true? I mean, we've already addressed some of this previously. Is belief the acceptance of a proposition of any God, or specifically the Christian God, or more specifically, this particular narrow version of the Christian God that Pascal accepts? Is this belief a costless exercise? His strawman skeptic basically says, that is very fine. Yes, I must wager, but perhaps I wager too much. Essentially, the objection that he's trying to answer is, hey, you're asking me to wager my life. You're asking me to wager my intellect. You're asking me to wager my integrity, my humanity, my sense of reality, and my sense of right and wrong. Isn't that too much to risk? And Pascal thinks not. And yet when we look around the world at the mass of beliefs and baggage that comes with belief in a specific God, a belief in a specific set of doctrines about this God, I don't see how anyone could argue that it doesn't cost you. And when the objection is launched, he essentially points out, or flatly asserts, that because you are risking a finite certainty for an infinite uncertainty, the uncertainty part no longer matters. And this is the point where I think he makes one of the most critical mistakes. He says, "And so our proposition is of infinite force when there is the finite to stake in a game where there are equal risks of gain and of loss, and the infinite to gain." How on earth did Pascal determine that there was equal risk? Essentially, it seems that this brilliant mathematician who's using probability, and this is the first implementation of decision theory, is doing the same sort of thing that I encountered at an Atheist in the Pub night in Austin, Texas. A PhD philosophy student came up and wanted to argue with me about something I'd said on the show, and I was a little intimidated. I don't have a PhD in philosophy. And yet he spent the next 30 minutes trying to argue that because you will either win the lottery or not win the lottery, that your odds are now 50-50. Now, this PhD candidate in philosophy clearly needed a much stronger grounding in statistics and probability. But Blaise Pascal has no excuse like that. He is essentially asserting that there is an equal probability between the proposition that God exists and the proposition that he doesn't exist. And he offers nothing at all to support this, at least within this particular discourse. And what's more, he closes this portion of the discourse by flatly stating, "This is demonstrable, and if men are capable of any truths, this is one." But for me, one of the most interesting parts of the original version of Pascal's wager comes at the end. Because I've said for years that belief is not merely a matter of simple choice. You cannot force yourself to believe something. Belief is the result of becoming convinced. You are compelled to convince something by reason and evidence. You can't simply choose to believe. And this is a problem for Pascal's wager, a problem that we've already addressed. But Pascal agrees with me and acknowledges that it may in fact be impossible for some people to believe. And he responds to this by saying, "True, but at least learn your inability to believe, since reason brings you to this, and yet you cannot believe. Endeavor then to convince yourself, not by increase of proofs of God, but by the abatement of your passions. You would like to attain faith and do not know the way. You would like to cure yourself of unbelief and ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you and who now stake all their possessions. These are people who know the way which you would follow and who are cured of an ill of which you would be cured. Follow the way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness." In modern Christianity, this is also known as fake it till you make it. Basically, Pascal is saying, I know that you may not be convinced and you can't force yourself to be convinced, but go ahead and do the religious practices and pretend as if you believe it so that you might deceive yourself and eventually come to a true belief. This is one of the most appalling, offensive assaults on intellectual integrity that's ever been offered. The entirety of Pascal's wager is an attempt to say that God is a good bet. And he already makes the mistake of claiming that the chance of God existing is equally likely as him not existing. But now, when faced with this proposition that I just can't believe this, there's not sufficient evidence to compel me to believe this, his argument is to go ahead and pretend. He's arguing not for belief in God, but for belief in belief. His faux skeptic at the end of this, when challenged to pretend as if they believe, basically says, but this is what I'm afraid of. And Pascal's response is, why? What have you got to lose? Pascal ends the discourse by saying, what harm will befall you by taking this side? You'll be faithful, humble, grateful, generous, a sincere friend, truthful. Certainly you will not have those poisonous pleasures, glory, and luxury. But will you not have others? I will tell you that you will thereby gain in this life, and that at each step you take on this road, you will see so great certainty of gain, so much nothingness in what you risk, that you will at last recognize that you have wagered for something certain and infinite for which you have given nothing. And so we end the original version of Pascal's wager with both an appeal to pretend that you believe, an admonition that you probably have nothing to lose, and a declaration that by accepting the proposition that God exists, you've given nothing. Several years ago, I came across an internet meme about fractal wrongness. Essentially, it's a mocking response that claims that your position is essentially wrong at every conceivable resolution. In its original form and the countless colloquial forms that followed, Pascal's wager is as close to fractally wrong as I think we're likely to get, which makes it especially frustrating that it's so common. It was presented so frequently by callers to our television show that I declared moratorium on the point for quite some time. Despite the fact that Pascal was a genius, the argument is the height of intellectual laziness, and it encourages not only more laziness, but intentional self-deception. If there is a God, surely it deserves better than this.
So why is Pascal's wager so common? It was presented so frequently on the TV show that I declared moratorium on it for a while. If you're calling into our show to talk about Pascal's wager, please don't. We're not going to address it. We've addressed it many times before. We have bigger fish to fry. There are many reasons why it's incredibly common. The first is that it doesn't require any significant understanding of theology, doctrine, science, or rationality. In fact, I'd argue that it almost depends on an insufficient understanding of those things. The argument itself is intuitive. It feels right, and it feels powerful to believers because it exploits their fears of the unknown, reinforces a fear of hell, while offering the greatest possible reward for the least amount of effort. It's not a safe bet. It's the perfect con.